Hello and welcome to the Politics and Prose bookstore. My name is Danielle and I'm an event staffer here at this location where we now host in-person and virtual events along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. For a full list of everything confirmed, please go to our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. While we've lifted the mask mandate here in the store, you are encouraged to wear a mask throughout the event, and we can provide one for you if you did not bring one. When we get to the time for your questions, we've placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right. It's over here. Please line up at the mic so that everyone can hear your question. We want that question to be heard in our recording of the event. We are both audio and video recording, live streaming today's program so that you or anyone you know can soon find it at the Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing up here at this table, so if you have not already purchased the books, we have many copies behind our registers at the front of the store and you will want to buy them, okay? We will ask you to line up starting here at the pillar, and we will come by to ask you your name for personalizations. So please have your books ready for us. Once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs and lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. So now, without further ado, tonight I am very excited to welcome Remica Bingham-Risher, celebrating the upcoming release of Soul Culture, Black Poets, Books, and Questions That Grew Me Up. Remica Bingham-Risher is a Cave Canem Fellow, an Afro-Latin poet. Her work has been published in the New York Times, The Writer's Chronicle, New Letters, Callaloo, and Essence, among other journals. She is the author of 3 volumes of her own poetry: Conversion, winner of the Naomi Long Magic Poetry Award; What We Ask of Flesh, shortlisted for the Hurston Wright Award; and Starlight and Error, winner of the Diode Editions Book Award. She lives in Norfolk, Virginia, with her husband and children. Miss Bingham-Risher will be joined in conversation with Mr. E. Ethelbert Miller. He is a writer and a literary activist and also Miss Bingham-Risher's teacher. He is the author of 2 memoirs and several books of poetry, including his most recent book, How I Found Love Behind the Catcher's Mask. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Remica Bingham-Risher and E. Ethelbert Miller.
Hey, folks. Danielle, that was fantastic. She told us that was her first introduction ever at Politics and Prose. So we appreciate you. Thank you guys for coming out. I'm going to read a little bit, and then we're going to have a conversation. Ethelbert was my teacher at Bennington. I'm not going to tell my age, but a lot of years ago. And he's also one of the writers that's featured in this book. But I'm gonna give you just a little kind of snippet of some of the work that's here. My daughter and grandson are visiting from Phoenix. My husband came up. We're from Norfolk, Virginia. So I'm gonna read some of the pieces that kind of outline some of what was happening in my life when I was interviewing these poets. So just a little background on the book. When I was in graduate school, one of my teachers, who shall remain nameless, but he's sitting up here, and he used to tell me that this awe syndrome that I had about writers, I really need to get over it. Okay, writing was something that like you can do yourself, and as a way to help me do that, he asked me to start interviewing poets, and so I decided to ask folks that I loved if they would sit down and talk with me. So that's how I ended up interviewing people like Lucille Clifton and Sonia Sanchez and all of these writers that I really dug a lot. And while I was reading their work, I was also coming into my own life. I got married. I became a stepmom. And so many of the things those writers taught me ended up in soul culture. So I'm going to read a little bit from a chapter called Courting Paradise with the writer A. Van Jordan. If you don't know his work, please check him out. But just a little bit of some background about what was going on in my own house at the time. Someone who's an old soul is usually a child who knows too much about the world, or who sings all the lyrics to Billy Paul's Me and Mrs. Jones right and loud, when it comes on the radio, though her parents haven't taught it to her, and she's strapped into her portable potty chair in the back seat when she is 3 years old. It's a true story. Or perhaps a child even younger, near 2, who can be smuggled into work at the fire department because there are terrors in the neighborhood and terrors at home, so he has learned to play almost silently, with little coaxing or attention, under the desk of his mother for 10-hour shifts. We are old souls in this house, my husband and I. People said, when we were too young to understand why, that we'd been here before, meaning we were carrying our sorrow or acumen, wearing it like a cloak. Just a little background about my cute, sweet husband that I keep looking at in the audience. When we were 13, we got caught kissing behind a movie theater. My mama still won't let it go. You know, it's the worst thing we ever did, right? But we lost touch many years after I left Phoenix and moved to Virginia to help take care of my grandmother. And he found me. And so I'll read just a little bit of that. When we were 13, we were sneaking kisses and spending countless hours on the phone. After we'd been calling each other boyfriend and girlfriend for 9 months, an eternity in teenage years, every night, without pretense and without fail, the boy with the old soul would say to me, "We're just too young. It happened too soon, but I swear I'll find my way back to you." He meant this deeply. How do we even know what love is? I asked him, and he was crushed at the thought of this. The thought of me not being sure of what I'd been saying and agreeing to all this time. He said, "I know I love you. I know what this is," and never wavered, despite my level-headed questioning. But he knew we'd move on, be fleeting as children are, and miss what light there might be in our hands. I thought his deep voice was smooth, and that his high cheekbones made him gorgeous, and that he was a little quixotic, a little crazy with all his devotion. But I also knew he often went home to a place that was imbalanced, violent, and over time, he had learned to wait silently, to let others flit around him, banging or yelling, busy with their own chaotic shifting. He knew, though I doubted it, that he and I would cling to some dream of this improbable love between us for the rest of our lives, even in the distance. So when we had been out of touch for years, when I had moved across the country and become a writer, when he had fathered children and helped his mother escape a burning house, when we were living peacefully and almost 30, he hung his hat on reckless desire and came to find me. So, oh, that's sweet. Thank you. So part of, what's happening in this book is that even though all that love was happening in my house, there's always this weird juxtaposition when you're a writer, particularly a writer of color. And what was also happening at the time when we were getting married and falling back in love was the Black Lives Matter movement. And my friend Romaine was killed in 2014 at the hands of police. And all these other Black poets were writing all of the poems that you would imagine we would be writing, kind of raging against the machine. And I wondered if it was all right to be writing love poems until I came to the work of a poet like A. Van Jordan, who was doing the same. I'm going to read a little piece for Ethelbert because he's here and he's one of these writers that I interviewed. And he's also one of the writers that reminded me that writing about love is always acceptable. I love June Jordan, not as much as Ethelbert, but I teach her poems to my students every year, right? Poem About My Rights is one of their favorites, right? This long missive where she reminds us that wrong is not my name, right? And whenever I teach that poem, I think about what I learned about love from Ethelbert and June Jordan. And this is just a little piece about that. Teaching June Jordan's poem about my rights, I think of E. Ethelbert Miller as they were dearest friends and unequivocal supporters. Maybe lovers, I could never figure out which, and didn't have the gumption as his student to ask. I know now, I'll tell you after. All right. Jordan wrote the introduction of Miller's book, Season of Hunger, Cry of Rain, relating that Miller was an invaluable resource for poets and a staunch advocate for Black poetry. How much Miller and Jordan loved each other is in the poems they wrote back and forth in their books for years. How much of his life he spent missing her is in their letters. Before Ethelbert and I talked in our interview, he was trying to get hundreds of letters that had been written back and forth between him and June Jordan in their lives published. Some of them were at Harvard's library. Some of them he still had, the letters that she wrote to him. So he said, there's one letter in which June writes about only having a few dollars. I have another letter where she's going to debate William Buckley, and she lists everything she's reading to prepare for the debate. Those things are important. Before she died, June was honored in Philadelphia for lifetime achievement. In the beginning of her speech, she cites her mother, her father, and me as the biggest influences on her life. If you're a biographer, you're going to take notice of a remark like that. In June's introduction to Ethelbert's book, Season of Hunger, Cry of Rain, she says his poems reflect on the ordinary, how our daily living adds up to the shadows of our devotion. In his poem, October 31st, dedicated to June, he dreams of being the silver streaks in her hair. So Ethelbert reminded me so much, grab a drink of water, that whatever is calling you, that's what you should write. And so when I was talking to these poets, not only did these interviews end up covering their lives, what brought them to writing, but also the things that they continued to meditate on time after time after time. And so I'll read just another little teeny piece about Lucille Clifton. Lucille is everybody's favorite writer. If we have to fight for it, we're all willing to say. I see everybody nodding in the audience. Isn't that amazing what Miss Lucille does for all of us? She was a mentor, a brilliant writer, as we all know, but also so funny. And I realize now there's so many of these things that people might not have known about her. And when I found her books in college, she kind of changed everything that I thought I could write about women. And so what light she shed for me, more than any high school course on sex ed, on the import of the vastness of the woman's body. I think my sex ed class was Miss Lucille's poems, actually. Nobody else was teaching me about that stuff. And so I just want to read a little piece that was something that people don't know about her because she swore me to secrecy before she passed. And then once she passed away, I told her daughters, all right, well, now I got to tell everybody who she really was. All right. I was working at Cave Canem, a retreat for Black writers, over the summer, and Miss Lucille came to teach. And this little tidbit happened behind the scenes. And Miss Lucille, if you know her poem, so many people love her because she's always writing about the ordinary, right? Like what happens to ordinary folks? How do we, care for the people around us who, just need a hand up? And not everybody, does what they say, but she did. When I went to work for Cave Canem behind the scenes, Lucille Clifton had returned to teach again. A few days into the retreat, word spread that one of the poets there had suffered a terrible loss. Their mother had died, and the poet would have to find a place to stay and withdraw from school to save what little money they had. I was typing up itineraries on a computer in the workroom where the faculty gathered as they discussed this sad turn of events. All the money you're paying me to be here, Clifton said, pointing at Toy Derricott and Cornelius Eady, the founding poets who also taught there each summer. All that money, put it in a check for that child. I tried so hard to do what people caution young folks to do, just stay at a grown folks' business, but I couldn't. My head snapped up from the desk at hand. I could tell I wasn't hiding my surprise by the way Clifton looked. Not a word of this, she said to me. That child has to go to school, and not everybody has to know everything. She taught me that day not only about illuminating the lives of the ordinary in poems, but also much about taking care of your community. Sometimes the practical, immediate thing is the most important thing. You should help someone get what they need, but you don't have to run and tell it all through the streets. Care for the suffering of others. You must live the way your poems sing. So just a little bit about Miss Lucille. Oh, thanks. Just a little bit about Miss Lucille. And I think maybe since we're just reading little pieces, maybe we'll have a conversation. Ethelbert, you want to talk now? Okay, don't get in trouble up here talking about June Jordan. All right.
Okay. First, I want to say I'm very, very happy for you. And, we have people here who are teachers. And I think when you ask yourself as a teacher, are you doing a good job? That answer or that question is answered by your students. And I think you've done a remarkable job. And, if I was able to influence your life in a small way, I feel blessed. So I just want to tell you that.
It was a big way. You just want all the kudos. No, really. It was a huge, huge, huge influence. This book is here because of Ethelbert.
Well, earlier today, we had a conversation on my show, On the Margin. And I asked Remica a lot of questions. You can gain access to that interview by going to wpfwfm.org. Just click on Archive Programs, scroll down to On the Margin 9 a.m. today, and you can get that interview, which is a good interview for an hour. What I wanted to do today, this evening, is to ask some of the questions I didn't get a chance to ask, so you get a sense of part two. But let me also mention something Remica didn't mention. Then that's all the names of the 10 writers are in the book, okay? And so if you pick up this book, you're going to have her interviews that she did with Sonia Sanchez, Lucille Clifton, Tim Siebels, Patricia Smith, Erica Hunt, Forrest Hammer, Natasha Trethewey, Henry Fanon Jeffers, and A. Van Jordan. Those are the writers who are in there. My first question that I wanted to ask you is about something that Erica, your interview with Erica Hunt, because you write in your book the following. Erica Hunt especially intimidated some of us because she considered a language poet one who veers away from the short form narrative most of us were writing and more towards the lyric. Her writing is often abstract, a patchwork of images and ideas and assemblage of fragments, like mothering, like most of us living. Talk about this, because many of us who find poetry difficult, many times it's like there's certain things like, okay, I don't get it. But then there are language poets who you really have to work with in terms of getting a full appreciation of the work. So use Erica Hunt as an example.
Well, Erica Hunt is brilliant. So if you haven't read her work, give her a chance. But the reason that, she's camped with some of these language poets is a lot of her poems, she's not really telling a snapshot, like a story of something that happened one day. She's kind of collaging together all these different ideas, but motherhood comes up so much. So the essay that she's a part of in this book is called Who Raised You? Because I was asking her, that's something we say in the Black community when we chastising people and when we love people. Girl, who raised you, right? And so it's an essay about, my mother, about mothering, but also I was asked in a keynote address that I was writing, what identity of mine was more important, my Blackness, my womanhood, or my artistry. And I was like, they all make me. What do you mean, right? So I put that question to Erica Hunt. And asked her, well, are the things that you're piecing together, do you camp them under a theme? Like, how do you come to these? And she's talked a lot about the fact that everything that you take in as an artist, she tries to hold on to a little piece of. So it's like a thread, a piece of red thread that's sewn throughout a garment, is the way she explained it. Isn't that brilliant? She's so smart. And that really opened up for me when I'm reading Erica Hunt or people that are considered kind of language poets that aren't telling me a little story, but are having me think deeply about like language. I'm trying to read those little pieces and hear them out loud for kind of the beauty in each line. And maybe I'll just have a line that ends up being something that really sticks out for me. And I think that's okay too. I don't always need a little story. Sometimes the poets are there for the beauty of the language. And that's, what I think of when I think of Erica Hunt.
You've talked about, I've enjoyed, you were talking about love. There's another term or word that appears in your book, and that's intimacy. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. Just about intimacy and like the dictionary definition. Are we going to go to Webster and talk about intimacy?
Your husband's in the audience.
Oh,
so
okay. We can talk about. Just kidding. No, I think really and truly though, like that question about love and intimacy came up a lot because when I was doing these interviews with poets, Ethelbert, this might have been the only time you ever lied to me as a teacher. He told me, if you do these interviews, you can publish those in journals, which I did, and then you can put together a collection and just publish the interviews. So that was my intent. And when I went to shop around all of these interviews, people said, these are beautiful, these are in-depth conversations. No one is going to read 10 interviews back to back. But what we are interested in is what you learned from these people. So tell us about the intimate details of your life and how these people influenced and made up those intimate parts of your life. And so that's how Soul Culture ends up being a memoir, because it's kind of tying together how these people really shifted and changed who I was as a person. And so intimacy for me kind of really works as the tie that binds in this entire book.
What did Black women writers teach you that others couldn't?
Ooh.
And what did you learn from queer Black women?
I talk about this, those particular questions in an essay called Intimate Tending. You heard that little teeny piece from Miss Lucille. But like I said, I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, so I didn't know a whole lot of Black people, certainly not a whole lot of Black writers, right? And so when I stumbled upon Black poets like Lucille, it took until I got to college to find Miss Lucille, but I had a mother who read, kind of voraciously, and I remember finding like snippets of things. I found Terry McMillan on her shelf. Remember when Waiting to Exhale was all the rage, right? Everybody was reading that. I found Toni Morrison's Paradise because Oprah had picked it for the book club. So, and every time I could, open and see a Black woman on the back cover, I was like, oh, snap. We can do this. Like, this can be done, right? Now, I was sneaking reading those books because you probably shouldn't read Paradise at 10, 11, 12. But, but I was always looking for myself in any kind of narrative that I could find. Even finding poems this morning, Ethelbert found this really beautiful clip of Eloise Greenfield, who's a children's book writer. And she wrote this wonderful book of children's poems called Honey, I Love. Anybody know? A few people know that book. And on the front cover of Honey, I Love in the 3rd grade, I found this cover of a little Black girl writing poems with big afro puffs. And that's what my hair looked like. So I thought, oh my goodness, this must be for me. So Black women writers talking about intimacy really reminded me that there were people who were trying to reflect my experience. And that experience was important enough to write about too. And that's what I was looking for.
I also asked you about queer Black women, because I know that people talk a lot about Lucille Clifton, but people often talk a lot about Audre Lorde.
Oh yes, Audre Lorde, Nikki Finney, Cheryl Clark. So these are people that I stumbled upon after Miss Lucille, right? Once I finally realized, oh my goodness, I swear, I grew up in Phoenix, and my mom was a reader but was not reading poetry. So when I stumbled upon Langston Hughes, I was like, okay, well, I guess all the other Black poets just died out. It's like at the end of Shakespeare, that's the end of the sonnet. Well, with Langston Hughes, I thought that was it. I didn't know any other people were writing until I found contemporary Black poets that were working at the time. And when I stumbled upon, I think Nikki Finney actually came first for me, her book Rice. You get kind of layer upon layer of experience. So you already get, kind of this double and triple living as a Black young woman, but as a Black young queer woman writing about experience. You just kind of get layer upon layer of what's happening in one's life and the difficulty that they have to wrestle with just to kind of move into any space. And that to me was miraculous. It was frightening. It was super cool, right? Some of it felt like it was forbidden. And when I started kind of getting to know these poets, I realized that for many of them, this was like, life's work. June Jordan, Pat Parker, I mean, they're writing poems that, they felt like people would try to do them harm for. So, the sanctity of which all of that work happened really moved me into the space where I'm writing about intimate experiences as well.
I'll ask you 3 more questions,
Sure.
and then we can have questions from the audience.
Okay.
Many people, and you said it today, people make reference to Cave Canem.
Yeah.
Talk about the structure of Cave Canem as well as the structure of the Callaloo Creative Writing Workshop.
Sure.
What happens when you go there? How, is it small groups?
Sure.
How long does it last?
Yeah. Those are Cave Canem and Callaloo were kind of writing retreats for poets, Black poets in particular. And so at Cave Canem, it's a small group. You're about 10 poets, and you write a different poem every day, an original poem. And then you walk into a workshop that morning, and maybe a writer like Lucille Clifton is sitting at the head of the table who's going to talk about that poem that you wrote and give you feedback to try to help you make it stronger with the group. And something very similar happens at the Callaloo Creative Writing Workshop, or it did when I was there, except you got to work with one really brilliant writer for 2 weeks. So I got to study with Natasha Trethewey. And this is before the Pulitzer Prize, when she was writing all the historical poems. And so you kind of get this intimate experience in a group of other folks that are trying to do writing and probably have never sat in a workshop setting with all poets of color or all poets who, they don't have to explain away any cultural references. We can just get to the craft, right? We don't have to talk about, why I keep bringing up Marvin Gaye, because he's Marvin Gaye. He's important, all right? I'm going to keep writing about him. And so those are some of the things that, make those workshops kind of stand out, because, you weren't justifying your living at any point. You were just sitting in a room with others who understood that to write about that living and to wrestle with that living gave you a better understanding of the world.
One writer we didn't talk about, Patricia Smith.
Yeah.
Talk about her.
I mean, if you know anything about poetry and performance at this point, Patricia Smith, right? She was the only person to ever win that huge, big national slam for 4 times in a row. But also, when I talked to her in the book, we talk about reinvention. The essay is called "Standing in the Shadows of Love," after the Four Tops song. Because we're both mega soul music fans, but also we were trying to remake ourselves. Patricia at that point hadn't talked at all about, she was once a journalist writing for the Boston Globe, had won a Pulitzer Prize, and was ousted for fabricating kind of lines, and had to reinvent herself and her life as a writer in a different genre, as a poet. And we're talking about that at the same time that my friend Romaine Brisbane was killed by police in 2014. And I was just trying to figure out, how do I make my way into a world that I feel like is intent on bringing danger to what I love? And Patricia talks about that, as well as the loss of her father, who was murdered when she was in her 20s. So we, strangely enough, everything from, going down the Soul Train line to finding your way to slam poetry comes up in that essay. But she, probably more than any other poet in the book, and maybe any other poet in my life, taught me about reinvention. And she's just a real gift. So if you don't know her work, get to know her work. But getting to know her as a person has really been the gift for me too. Yeah.
Well, my last question brings us back to you, not as a writer, but as a teacher.
Yeah.
And so my question is, how do you teach those writers that many people think are difficult, like Russell Atkins, Nathaniel Mackey, Jay Wright, or Melvin Tolson?
How do I teach? How do I, if a Jay Wright walks into my classroom, what do I do? Or how do I teach the work of Jay Wright to students who aren't ready?
How do you teach right? Well, okay.
I
Right.
mean, those are two different questions, right?
Right.
Those are two different questions.
Right.
So how do I teach the student who walks into my classroom and is difficult in the way that Jay Wright is?
Right, okay.
That's a good question. First of all, if you got as much talent as Jay Wright, come on to my class. Just come on in. I don't care how difficult you are. But, you taught me this. Ethelbert is always, he always has a few people that he's kind of like promoting at any moment. But I asked him during our interview, what do you do with the folks that walk into your office and they just think writing is a hustle? I don't know who told them that, because writing is not, unless you're writing Harry Potter, you're not making a whole lot of money. But I don't know who told them writing is a hustle. But you told me, you can very simply, you can figure out who's really serious about craft and who isn't. So give them some writing exercises and let's see if they actually work on them. So the students that come to me, I teach at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, and I actually teach students that I teach faculty, and I teach students that are in the MFA programs. It's the Master of Fine Arts. So they know, okay, I believe in the power of the word. I understand that I might want to move my own words out into the world. So I don't have too many students that are so hard-headed that they just completely disregard anything you say, but I am someone who's very serious about craft. I don't like telling, but I do like asking plenty of questions. If something's not working, I always tell them, if I'm asking this question, that means as a reader, somehow there's a disconnect here. And that usually is my way in to help them think about what isn't connecting for the reader.
Well, this is our time to connect with the audience. So if you have questions, please come to the mic here and ask your question. Any questions?
No questions? Come on. Oh, he's cute.
Oh, that's a handsome guy.
He's cute.
I tell you.
Oh. I'm sorry, babe. That's my husband. I'm not just flirting with a man in the audience, y'all.
Yes, thank you. So, in regards to your history of poetry, and then the conversion over to prose and something that Ethelbert has been pushing for a long time, getting these essays going, and critical work. How's just jumping from one genre into exploring a whole new genre, how was that transition for you?
You know how it was. I kept you up every night for 2 years trying to write this memoir, really and truly. That's a good question. Really and truly, though, he got all the earfuls. I think, all of my books before this have been books of poems. So really, Ethelbert is another thing that I learned from you. We were working on this interview when you had published your first memoir, when Fathering Words, I think, had come out and was one of the city picks. And so you were talking about the fact that there's so much that has to function outside of the line of poetry. There are some things that you need more time and space to wrestle with. And I thought for sure that I was just writing an homage to the writers I loved. That's it. I was just letting Lucille Clifton have more space because she always needs more space. I was letting Sonia Sanchez have more space because we can't ever get enough Sonia Sanchez in the world. But what ended up being of interest to people was my own wrestling with their work. And so I found that if I had extra time and space to talk about how I was changed by these folks, I would use it. So one of the lines that I go back to in the book is honor the elders' voices and honor your own. And that's just something that I continue to try to do.
Another question? Well, I would ask you this question.
Okay.
Every book that you've done has won an award.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, how do you deal with success?
I'm very grateful. As a writer, I'm telling you, 90% of your life is no, right? Will you publish this poem? No. We like you, but no. Will you publish this book? No, we're not interested in that. So when you get a yes and then something on top of the yes, it's a wonderful cherry, but it's not the thing that keeps you going, right? Because there's so many no's that if the thing that kept you going were the awards, you barely ever get anywhere. So the thing that, keeps you going is I love wrestling with the words on the page, until I was, maybe 13, 14 years old. I thought for sure I was going to be a singer. I was going to go to Broadway. I was going to just be famous enough to get into the Grammys, but I could still walk through the grocery store, right? So it was going to, I had my levels, and then I sang a really terrible note at a nursing home that we were singing, and I realized I can't redo that. Like, everybody saw it, that's it. And with writing, I can wrestle this thing to a ground. I can do 30, 40 revisions of something before I make its appearance in the world. And that to me was a real gift, because I got to wrestle with my own understanding. I got to wrestle with my own questions. And that's something that I will continue doing, whether there are awards or not. Yeah.
You know a lot of writers. You have the 10 that you interviewed in your book. You're probably still connected with Cave Canem.
Yeah.
What do you see are some of the trends? Are some of the writers that are emerging now doing things that are different? You know, we talked earlier on today about Natasha Trethewey encouraging people to use history and photographs.
Yeah.
What are some of the trends that you see coming? Like, if, for example, we looked at Langston Hughes and Dunbar and County Cullen. What are people, and moving beyond Baraka, what are people today doing?
You know, what's interesting, one of the things that I really adore, A. Van Jordan that I interviewed, you know, he was following in the tradition of like Arita Dove, who was the poet laureate, right? She was writing Thomas and Beulah, these, you know, really lovely poems. But it was one book that circled around the life of one person who, you know, was not the poet, right? Like just these persona poems. Van Jordan did the same thing with Magnolia. She won the first black child to go to the National Spelling Bee, and she came in second. And so he wrote this whole book of poems. It's really beautiful, illuminating her life. And I see more and more poets now taking that cue, like writing persona poems about an event or an idea that kind of revolve around one historical figure or one person in the family. And I love it, because it's a different way for us to tell a story. It's also happening so much. You're seeing in like children's books and in YA, all these novels in verse now. Baby, we was doing that like years ago. So that's, you know, it's all coming from those folks who were brilliant enough to do it. You know, Mahogany Brown and Kwame Alexander, all these brilliant folks are doing it now. So I love it. I love that it's trickling down and giving us a new way to talk about someone's life.
But my final question is, how do we know when poetry's good or when it's bad?
Because we can answer that in 5 minutes at the reading. Okay.
The reason why I say that is because one of the things that we see, many people are expressing themselves. If, for example, someone emerges as, say, a critic, pretty much that's one person's view. Okay, absolutely. Somebody would say, well, why should I listen to so-and-so if, for example, I've got X number of likes on my particular social page, or people applauded me when I got up and, you know, at the mic on the evening before. So how do we assess, especially in terms of teaching, where people come in and they have the excitement, they have the energy, you know, how do we say, okay, that sounds good, but it's not good?
That's really interesting. It's also, you know, in many ways a matter of opinion. But the way I handle it in my class is I'm trying to teach craft. So I'm trying to teach them some of the brilliant things that poets have done in the past that continue to stick with us, right? So I'm taking in people like Lucille Clifton. I'm taking in Allen Ginsberg. We were talking about him a little bit earlier, right? I'm taking in these voices that I think have continually done something really interesting with the work. And then we're dissecting them. We're kind of reverse engineering those poems so they can see, oh, this is what happens when you really think about what verb you use to describe something. This is what happens when you're describing this sunset differently from any way you've ever heard it. When you're building in metaphors that really connect with someone on a sensory level. They can see it, they can taste it, they can smell it. So those are the kinds of things that I'm doing to try to heighten a poet's understanding and then heighten their work at the same time.
The question, I like that response. The question I'm looking at is, a writer, the equivalent of Ornette Coleman, comes into your class. You know what I'm saying? Like he's breaking all the rules, right? And he's breaking all the rules, right? Exactly,
Coleman,
right.
Like jazz aficionado,
right.
Listen, if you're brilliant, break the rules. You still have to get an A in my class. But if you, you know, so I tell them all the time, really, when you're teaching poetry, and this is good for our teachers in the back. Hey, Danielle, I know you're starting tomorrow, girl. So when you know, you're, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to, like, put you on the spot. I'm sorry, Danielle's teaching high school. And so I tell them all the time, it's often about quantity, and then we can talk about quality, right? Neruda is 19 writing all those love poems that we, you know, that he wasn't sitting in anybody's college classroom or anybody's MFA, right? That was like natural talent and also just kind of natural desire to like really wrestle with the word. So I tell them, do the work, right? You have 20 poems to write. You write those 20 poems, you're going to get your grade. But also, poem 1, will never be as good as poem 20 because you'll have learned all these techniques to really heighten what you do. So I think that's, that's the way we handle it. I'm not letting you ask any more questions. That's
Okay.
it.
Any last question from the audience? If not, Remica will sign books.
That's it.
Okay. I think we're going to sign.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah? Okay.